Happy Star Wars Day, everybody. In honor of May the 4th and Star Wars Day, got some good Star Wars jokes for you. Which program do Jedi use to open up PDF files? They use Adobe One Kenobi. Which website did Chewbacca get arrested for creating? WikiLeaks. Why did Anakin Skywalker cross the road? To get to the dark side. Oh, so funny. All right. We are doing the second letter of St. Peter. The reason we're doing this letter is because it's very similar, or rather, it ties in very closely to the letter of St. Jude. So it makes sense to read these two in tandem. After we do this letter, you are going to be having a test or quiz on what we've covered over the last month. I don't really know if it's a test or quiz yet. We'll see. All right. So, Second Peter is kind of unique for a couple reasons. One reason it's kind of unique is because we don't really know if Peter actually wrote it. If Peter did write it, then he would have had to have written it after First Peter, but before his death in the year 67. So we know St. Peter was crucified in the year 67, and we know he wrote First Peter in the year 63 or 64. So that means that if St. Peter is the author, he had to have written it between the year 64 and his death in the year 67. However, it is possible that a different person wrote the letter of St. Peter. Now, if a different person wrote the letter of St. Peter, then it would have been one of Peter's disciples, someone who wrote this letter after St. Peter died based on either notes that St. Peter left for this letter or things that St. Peter said. So if it's true that one of St. Peter's disciples wrote this, that means it would have been written somewhere between the year 80 and the year 90 after or AD. And also, if that's true, it means that the person who wrote it wanted us to understand that it's written in St. Peter's voice. So it's kind of like a voice from the dead, right? The author is attributing this letter to St. Peter. He wants us to think of what he's saying as the words of St. Peter. Regardless of whether or not Peter wrote this, it doesn't really matter, because either he did write it and it's his voice, or he didn't write it, but the author is using St. Peter's voice to do so. All right, so we didn't learn about First Peter, which is fine, but you do need to know a little bit about First Peter in order to understand Second Peter. Second Peter is written to the same group of people that First Peter was written to. It's basically Christians in general, a really big group of Christians. And in this, he wants to encourage these Christians to remain strong in their faith. The letter is also warning these Christians against a group of false teachers who reject the parousia. Remember, the parousia is a fancy term we use to describe the second coming of Christ at the end of the world, when he will return to judge the living and the dead. Right? So this is an image of the parousia. It's an icon on the ceiling of a church. Right? Christ will come. He'll still have his human body, but he will come. When Christ was on earth with us, his human nature was more visible than his divine nature. And when he returns in the second coming in the parousia, his divine nature will be more visible than his human nature. He'll still have both, though. right? And he comes as a judge, right? Um, quick note about why I included this image of this guy being crucified. According to tradition, St. Peter was crucified by the Roman authorities in the year 67 in the city of Rome, and he was allegedly crucified upside down. Right? So this is an image of St. Peter being crucified upside down. All right, so we're going to start chapter 1. We're not going to get very far into it, though. So he opens the letter with a greeting, as is traditional. Normally, when you're writing a letter in the ancient world, you begin by saying who you are, who you're addressing it to, and you begin the letter with a greeting. So the greeting is, may grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord. So grace and peace here are things that Christians receive as a benefit of being Christians. Then he says, may grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord. So knowledge here is an important word because it doesn't refer only to intellectual knowledge. Right? Intellectual knowledge is something that the false teachers claim that they have for themselves. In fact, the false teachers, just like in 1 John, are called Gnostics. Right? So in 1 John, the false teachers are a specific group of Gnostics called Cerinthians because they reject the unity of Christ and Jesus. Remember, they think they're two separate beings. St. Peter here is not writing against Cerinthians specifically. He's writing against Gnostics in general who reject the Parousia. So these Gnostics believe that they have special knowledge of God, which gives them a special relationship to God that other Christians don't have, that other people don't have. So they think that their intellectual knowledge, what's inside of their brains, kind of shields them from sin and shields them from some of the negative effects that sin has. In fact, the word Gnostic comes from a Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So when Peter is saying knowledge here, he's making like a really subtle dig at his opponents, the Gnostics. So knowledge doesn't refer to intellectual knowledge here. Instead, it refers to knowledge that comes from experience, right? He's saying, he's Peter and the apostles and the early Christians, they have knowledge of God because they have been close to God. They have experienced him. All right, we'll do one more and then we'll stop. So Peter lists off a bunch of virtues, and he does it in a way that suggests they're like links in a chain. Each virtue is linked to one that comes before it. So in order to master the next virtue, you have to master the virtue that comes before it, right? And these virtues form a chain that link us to having experience, knowledge, true love of Christ. So he says, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, right? So faith and virtue are connected. Virtue with knowledge, knowledge with self-control, self-control with steadfastness, steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. So this chain that he makes, this virtue chain, connects faith to love. And it goes through a bunch of other virtues to connect those two. All right, that's a good intro to 2 Peter and the first part of 2 Peter. So we'll stop here and we'll continue tomorrow.